Excellency, Madam, distinguished colleagues, friends. Yes, thank you for calling me mother, but like a typical mother, I land up, whenever the baby asks for help or support. So that attitude is definitely there. I want to welcome all of you to what is actually a very important initiative of the United Nations and of all of you in the TEEB community. Thank you, Joyce, for your wonderful introduction, highlighting all the important issues, which is that cheap food has truly high costs. You pointed out that supermarket prices are not the same as values or as costs, and indeed sometimes I feel that people, when they are thinking about food systems, they forget that they don't only have a supermarket wallet, they also have a health wallet, which is invisible, they have a climate wallet, they have an employment wallet, and unfortunately the only wallet's depletion or addition that they seem to count is the supermarket wallet, and that leads to the misunderstanding of the values and the costs of food systems. TEEBAgriFood is important not least because of the context today, and I'd just like to set the context with two comments. One on the SDGs, because we are clearly entering a decade in which the SDGs will become perhaps the most important point of entry for any policy change that we want to make in countries. And secondly, about what is being discussed most recently as a new deal for nature and people amongst the nations in the CBD and also amongst businesses and civil society. Firstly, on the SDGs, it's too easy to think that somehow the mandate of TEEBAgriFood will only affect SDG 2, but that's not true. Because if we look at the goals of nutrition and adequate food, in fact, more than 1 billion people depend on the oceans, on fisheries, for their main supply of animal protein, which is from fish, and therefore we are straight into SDG 14. And other forms of food are land-based, so unless we ensure that land is sufficiently productive and is available and is used by the farmers themselves, the 1.1 billion especially, who are small farmers, less than 2 hectares, we are not going to be able to achieve SDG 15, which is life on land. And we must be conscious of the fact that SDG 13, the climate goal, if that is not achieved, then that puts at risk almost all land-based production in terms of the strains that work, don't work, and crop productivity. So when we talk about the SDGs, and if we wish to come to any conclusions on either a policy change or a production system evaluation or a product comparison, any of these so-called applications of TEEBAgriFood, if we want to understand them in the context of the SDGs, we have to use a toolkit like TEEBAgriFood, which is comprehensive, which is universal, and which enables academicians to dig deep into all of the costs and all of the values, not just the supermarket price side of the food that is served and sold to us and served to us. So when we are asked questions in the context of SDGs, all of you in the TEEB community, in TEEBAgriFood, have a very important and useful role to play, because you have with you the TEEBAgriFood framework, which will enable you to provide answers which truly address the SDGs in their genuine connectedness and complexity, and not just from the point of view of any single SDG like SDG 2. And remember, I haven't even touched upon the other points that Joyce raised, which is about human health. Whether it is nutrient deficiency, obesity, diabetes, or endocrine disruption, the driver is, unfortunately, our diets. Our diets, in fact, have become, according to the Global Nutrition Report, the #1 driver of the global burden of disease. And once again, evaluating that is part of the framework of TEEBAgriFood. So you see how really necessary and important it is for you to have this toolkit with you, to be able to connect with policymakers in the context of their sustainable development goals, and to provide holistic responses to their very genuine policy questions. The second area is what is known nowadays as the New Deal for Nature and People. This is really an idea whose time has come because the urgency of the loss of nature is so severe that honestly all stakeholder groups have to come to the table immediately and simultaneously if we are to achieve transitions in the loss of nature. If we measure the volume of wild species, that has gone, if we reference 1970 as a base, let's say 100, that has gone down to about 40, 42 right now. So, and that is the result of something called the Living Planet Index that my organization, the WWF, has worked on. We have huge losses in ecosystem areas, we have huge losses in endangered species, and species losses have gone to rates which are 100 to 1,000 times the historic rates. So we have an urgency here which is second to none. And it's very heartening to see people and the CBD and businesses and traditional communities come together, voicing the same concern and wanting to do something about it. Each of these groups will form their own agendas. But all of these agendas, in order for them to be powerful and to achieve, will have to be congruent and targeting the same targets. It cannot be that the government's agenda targets one set of targets, the business agenda another set, the people agenda a third set, and the community's agenda a fourth set. We have to target the same targets. And there's a lot of conversation going on amongst academic circles and in the business world as to what these targets should be. And there are, of course, the Aichi targets, of which two, that is target 11 and target 15, are numerical, therefore easier to measure and to report on. Aichi 11 is probably the only target of the Aichi targets where we can see demonstrable progress from 0.4% of ocean areas to now around 7%, and the target is 10% by 2020, from 12% land areas under conservation to 14% around now, and the target is 17%. So we can see the movement taking place. And we should keep these targets because policymakers, governments, leaders have committed political capital to get us there. But equally, we also have to look at targets on species rarity. So let's look at the IUCN Endangered Red List and see critically endangered species. Can we reduce the number to half by 2030? Not by killing them off, but by protecting them and taking them off the critically endangered. Equally, we have to look at species abundance. These are all dimensions of nature, of biodiversity. And perhaps we can look at the Living Planet Index or other such indicators and so on. But an important point is that if we look at expanding the amount of land under conservation, there are limits because sustainable use is required. Communities need access and have access. Communities own or have access in priority to 25% of the land areas. So we have to look also at what are the human activities that impact this land which is under conservation or not under, or can be under conservation. And once again, the single most activity is agriculture. And the way in which we do agriculture makes a huge difference, whether we use intensive farming models with pesticides and fertilizers which deplete or destroy soil biology and make life difficult for insects. And we have seen massive losses in insect populations in Europe, 70% down over the last 40 years. Whether we look at that kind of farming or whether we look at the more hopeful kind of farming that has been done in the state of Sikkim or in Andhra Pradesh, in my country, in India, I think the latter is probably closer to the answer, but then we need to prove it. And again, research is required. Setting targets on the amount of land that is under natural farming would make a huge difference, probably as much, maybe even a greater difference than asking for another few percentage of land areas to come under conservation. And we have to evaluate that. So who's going to evaluate that? Once again, Salman, the answer is you and your network here, right? So it is all of you, the TEEB community, who will be asked these questions and asked to evaluate them because the toolkit is with you. Friends, I'm not for a second suggesting that the answers are easy. They are not, because the whole area of TEEBAgriFood is about evaluating complexity. But the fact of the matter is that we are facing the single most complex challenge of our times, which is sorting out a broken food system. Yes, we have a smart and intelligent toolkit which helps us do that. But at the end of the day, we are addressing complexity. The good news is that we have the toolkit and that we have excellent academicians like yourselves and people involved in the UN and administrators to handle it. But the bad news is that there are no simple solutions to complex problems. There will be only complex solutions, and we have one in front of us. So I encourage you and I request you, please try and use this solution. See what applications you can use of the TEEBAgriFood framework. See how it works. Try and improve it. And please, as you are doing now, share your experiences with others so that they may also use this toolkit and come out with recommendations which are useful for policymakers, for businesses, for societies and communities, and of course for people at large. Thank you.